Firstly, my name is Jo. Lovely to see people. So I work at the Institution of Environmental Sciences. And for anyone who doesn't know, as I know we've got quite a few people who are not our members here today. So the IES, we're a professional membership organisation that unify communities of scientists, policymakers and academics to transform knowledge on environmental science and support the transition to a sustainable society. Now, today's event has been organised as part of a project that we've been running at the IES that's been endorsed by the UN Ocean Decade. It's called Turning the Tide, Systems Thinking for a Sustainable Ocean. And what I'll do is I'll pop some links into the chat in a bit for you to find out a little bit more about that project if you're interested. I will get started with introducing the session then. So really pleased to be hosting this event today, which is on an introduction to systems thinking for tackling wicked problems. We're really pleased to be joined by Gerald Midgley today. So Gerald is a professor of systems thinking in the Centre for Systems Study at the University of Hull in the UK. He has a real wealth of expertise in systems thinking, having held various research leadership roles in both academia and government. He's also run his own consultancy company and worked as a senior science leader in a government environmental science institution in New Zealand. And yeah, you'll be seeing some examples of his various different projects during the session today. So Gerald has also written almost 400 papers on systems thinking, systemic leadership and community operational research. He's been involved in a wide variety of projects worldwide, including in the public sector, natural resource management and community development. And he's also written and edited 12 books, including the Handbook of Systems Thinking is currently in press. So yeah, that was just a brief introduction to our speaker. Just to explain then how the session today will work. So Gerald will be giving a presentation for roughly around an hour. And then after that, there'll be a chance for a Q&A session with the audience. So yeah, I would encourage people to use the chat throughout the session to pose your questions. So yeah, do kind of put them in as they come up, and then I will moderate that and be asking them later on your behalf. As this session's being run as a meeting, if people did want to kind of ask their questions verbally as well, then we can do that at the end. If you want to kind of raise their hands. And yeah, just a quick bit of housekeeping, as this is being held as a meeting, if people are able to just keep themselves on mute throughout the session just to avoid any disruptions, then that would be great. And yeah, just to let people know that the session is being recorded and we'll be uploading it onto our YouTube channel within a week. And yeah, I can send a follow-up to everyone just to let you know about that as well. So that is everything for me. And yeah, I will now hand over to Gerald.
Okay, so let me just head off. So I've been asked to give an introduction to systems thinking. And there are two ways to do that. One is to kind of pick a little part of it, maybe one methodology, and give details of that and case studies of practice. The other way to do it is the way I've done it, which is to give lots of different examples of different approaches. They'll give you much more of a flavour of the variety in our field. The pros and cons are you get more depth the first way, and it's a little bit like putting your mouth to a fire hose the second way. But really, you need to be able to see the variety of things that are possible in our field. Otherwise, you could get just led down into one particular track without realizing all of the other rich resources that are available to you. So this is what I want to cover with you. I want to say a little bit about wicked problems. That's highly complex and intractable problems. Policymakers often use that kind of wicked problem language. And then I'll answer that question, what is systems thinking, at a fairly basic level. Now, a key thing to be aware of is that we're talking about 100 years of research in this field, and it covers physics, biology, chemistry, family therapy, management, policy, you name it. Systems ideas have been developed in those disciplines. I can only focus on a fraction of that, so I'm going to focus on things in relation to policy and management, as I think they're the most relevant to this kind of audience. And I think it's worth mentioning that we've kind of gone past a tipping point in relation to interest in systems thinking. So I think there was a key point around 2017 where the UN, the WHO, and the OECD all called for a systems approach at the same time for joining up the Sustainable Development Goals. And as a result of that, there was suddenly masses of interest. And just to kind of illustrate the amount of interest that's going on, certainly in the UK at the moment, in 2021, there was a community of practice in central government with 300 people in it. By the time we'd got to 2022, that was 600 people. In 2023, it was 700 people. So it's really picking up steam, the interest in systems thinking. So I'm going to illustrate different systems approaches for different purposes with practical examples, and all those practical examples are drawn from my projects over the last 30 years. Some are environmental projects, some are social projects, some cross those two kind of categories. Some of them are quite old, but to me, the age doesn't matter. It's whether it's still relevant today. So some of them are bang up to date, like what I did last month, and some of them are 30 years old. And they all come from UK and New Zealand, where I've done most of my work, except one, which is the work of one of my students in Nigeria. So the term wicked problems was coined by Rittel and Weber back in 1973. It's a term that's still widely used in policy circles, and there's sometimes people complain about the use of the term wicked. It's kind of almost got a value judgment to it, but I quite like it because it really it kind of says something pithy about the nature of these really difficult problems. So the kind of characteristics of wicked problems include many interlinked issues, so high degrees of complexity, cutting across the usual kind of silos we work with, multiple agencies involved, multiple scales, different views on the problem and potential solutions, conflict, often conflict and power relations, making change difficult, and uncertainty about the possible effects of action. So we're talking about really intractable problems that often have to be managed rather than solved. And it's those particular kinds of problems I'm particularly interested in. And certainly many of the global environmental problems we're living with now fit this kind of description. So if I'm saying that systems thinking can help with those kinds of problems, let me just say a little bit about what systems thinking is. And I'm going to split the term systems thinking into its two component parts. So I'm going to say something about thinking first, and then go on to the term system. So in terms of thinking, most people think of thinking in a kind of lay sense, it's what goes on in your head as you relate ideas together. If you know a little bit about the neuroscience, you might be aware that thinking and feeling go together. They're both part of one single cognitive system. But I'm talking about thinking in a much more three-dimensional sense than that. So the first dimension is what goes on in your head. The second dimension is the fact that we use language. So that means we can think collectively as well as individually. We can actually share ideas and build insights and evolve our understandings. And also the third dimension is that we think in the context of action in the wider material world. So we actually get our thoughts inform our actions. There's feedback from our actions, and that informs our thinking. So thinking is fundamentally relational in three dimensions: within our minds, between people, and in a context of action in the wider world. So that's what I mean by thinking. And when you put the word system in front of it, you can think of a system like I've got on the picture here. And if I just walk you through this, you'll see here that there are various parts in the system in relation to each other. And those parts interact, and they give rise to a system that has properties that can't just be traced back to one of the individual parts, but can only be understood in terms of the whole. And that's what people call emergent properties. So an easy example is your own life. Your body is an organized set of parts, your organs. If it wasn't organized in the way it is, you wouldn't be alive. You'd just be a random heap of organs on the floor. So your life is an emergent property of your body as a system. So we have parts in relationship, creating a whole system, giving rise to emergent properties. We also have a boundary, which means that we can say what we think is inside the system and what is outside the system. Of course, different people might have different views on where the boundary should be drawn. And boundaries and systems and emergent properties, relationships, they're all seen from a particular perspective. So that's why I've put this woman down in the bottom left-hand corner, because every system is defined from a perspective. So, for example, just as a simple example, for a neuroscientist, a brain is a highly complex organ, and you would put a scalpel into it very, very carefully. For a butcher, a brain is just a piece of meat, and they put a cleaver straight through it. So taking account of perspectives is important, but perspectives are not taken from the outside, as I've illustrated it there. The observer or participant is actually part of the system, and that means that they only ever have a partial view of that system. And it's partial in two senses. It's partial in that it's incomplete. They only see the parts that they're interacting with and may have some notion of the rest, but it'll never be complete because there's too much complexity for any one individual to see. And it's partial in the sense that they are motivated by purposes and values to achieve something in that context. So there's two meanings to partiality there. So it's why when you get into systems thinking, you find that systems thinkers emphasize a lot about understanding more of your own partiality. Both that's the case for participants. The more participants can be aware of the limitations of their own perspectives, their own boundaries that they're drawing, the relationships they see and they don't see, the more options for thinking that they have available to them. And it's the same for you in running a project, that you need to be thinking about these kinds of issues of perspective and boundaries and relationships in the way you design your project. So I've introduced some concepts here. I've introduced the concept of system itself, the relationships between the parts and across the system, the notion of a boundary, what's inside and outside, and the perspective that it can be seen from. And from those four concepts, you can derive four systems thinking skills. And this comes from the work of Derek and Laura Cabrera in the States. And I think it's quite a useful framework because they talk about four systems thinking skills: exploring boundaries, mapping relationships, understanding systems and how they produce emergent properties, and appreciating multiple perspectives. So those are concepts that are abstracted out, if you like, from that basic systems idea and can be represented as systems thinking skills. And really, systems thinking is very closely related to critical thinking. Some people actually say critical systemic. And the reason is because it gives us the ability to rethink these things. We can rethink that the boundaries that we're working with to overcome taken for granted boundaries. We can rethink the relationships that matter, take account of things that we may not have noticed before. We can rethink about how systems are defined and which emergent properties matter. And we can rethink the perspectives that we see and find new perspectives, for example, to explore. So once you've seen those 4 systems thinking skills, it can help you begin to understand some of the variety of systems thinking approaches. One of the things you need to know at this point, because there's been these 100 years of research, there are literally hundreds of methods, methodologies, and approaches out there. And this is why it's important to have a framework to make sense of some of that variety. All the approaches I'm going to talk about are practiced in action research mode. That means they're not just, you're not just observing systems or interviewing participants, you're actually working with people to facilitate change. And what I began to realize when I first saw this framework from Derek and Laura Cabrera is that these concepts underpin different systems approaches in the sense that all of the systems approaches tend to prioritize one of these thinking skills, one of these concepts, one of these thinking skills. They're all the sophisticated ones, use all of them, but they tend to prioritize one over the others. So, for example, we've got approaches for exploring value and boundary judgments about what you include or exclude from analysis in your project. We've got approaches for understanding complex causality, sort of modeling approaches where you map the vicious and virtuous circles and you explore the possible consequences of intervention. There are approaches for developing viable and highly responsive organizations at multiple scales. There's some lovely work by one of my colleagues, Angela Espinosa, who talks about a kind of ideal model for global sustainability where you can really work from global to local scales in a fractal sense, looking at how things need to be organized. There are also approaches for addressing conflict, exploring multiple perspectives, trying to develop mutual understanding and agreeing solutions that people are willing to implement. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is effectively give you one example of an approach from each of these quadrants in this diagram. And I'm going to give you practical examples of that. As I say, that's not the whole variety of what's out there, but it will give you a good indication of the variety of different approaches that might be available to you. And I'm going to start here with exploring value and boundary judgments. About what should be included and excluded. And this is a methodology called boundary critique, which it's been developing really since the 1960s. Some of the more recent work, though, is stuff that I've developed. And I've developed this diagramming language, which helps, I think, to conceptualize the issues of boundary judgments. So what you see here is a diagram where there's a boundary that represents the inclusion of both stakeholders in your projects and the issues that concern them. And naturally, it also speaks to the exclusion of stakeholders and issues. So it's who you're involving and what issues matter. There's also values connected to that. So by values, I don't mean general principles like kindness and generosity. I mean what matters to people in the context of action. So it's those kind of purposes and values that help drive the setting of boundaries of what's relevant to people. And yet we don't come into the world as kind of autonomous thinking subjects with unlimited way of expressing our purposes and values. We tend to come into institutions that where there are undiscussables, power relationships. It's sometimes difficult to express some values over others. So there's constraints on the values. That's why I've developed it as a two-way diagram. But exploring each of these can help you shift the other. So actually looking at different possible values can help you shift the boundaries that you consider. So you can begin to see that new things might be relevant. Or exploring the boundaries might actually make you realize that different purposes and values might need to be considered. Now, the central idea here, which is common to all systems approaches, is that systems thinkers assume that everything in the world is either directly or indirectly connected with everything else. But because we can't have a God's eye view of that interconnectedness, our perspective is always partial in those two senses I mentioned before. It's both limited and it's informed by our purposes and values. And a key contribution to this work came from a guy called Werner Ulrich in the 1980s. And he said, this is all about how we explore boundaries and justify our boundary choices in dialogue with other stakeholders. So you can begin to get never a fully comprehensive view, but a more comprehensive view by getting into dialogue with different stakeholders and actually explore the inclusion and exclusion of issues and the people who are concerned with those issues. Now, once you actually take that basic notion, you can begin to represent things like conflict and marginalization using this kind of visual language. And I'm going to just show you a conflict diagram first. So imagine there's two stakeholder groups here. They each have their own purposes and values, and they each have their own boundaries of what's relevant to them. You might want to think about, this is a situation I've met numerous times, especially in the government work I did in New Zealand, working with farmers and conservationists. So the area of common concern in the middle here might be water. It might be the water in a river, let's say. So from the point of view of the farmers, they're interested in food production and profitability. The water to them is a resource for irrigation. On this side of it, you have conservationists who are concerned with biodiversity, saving native species. For them, the water is a habitat for fragile ecosystems. So what's happening is that the area of common concern is literally seen differently by people on different sides of this kind of conflict. And of course, once people begin to dig in and justify their perspective against others rather than exploring mutually, you begin to get stereotyping of people on the so-called other side. So you'll get environmentalists calling farmers sort of greedy profiteers, and you'll get farmers talking about environmentalists as tree huggers. And this is the kind of situation I've had to work with numerous times in New Zealand. But I'm going to give you an example of how this kind of understanding of conflict can help in a project, because I'm not interested in this purely as a theoretical idea. I'm interested in how this can help us understand how to intervene. So the project example I want to give you is from the work of one of my ex-PhD students, Daniel Afua, who worked with a food production company in in Nigeria. And the project, when he went in there, was all about reducing waste. The organization wanted to make its processes more efficient, and it wanted to reduce the amount of waste it was producing in order to increase profitability and stimulate some growth. Now, the question he asked is, what if we were to involve local communities and not just stick within the organizational boundaries, which is usually what you do in these kinds of waste minimization projects. You usually maybe go to supply chains, but you don't generally go to the local community. So he'd done a lot of scoping within the organization. They had identified some really key issues. One of the key issues is that there was an unreliable electricity supply. So there were often large blackouts. Chickens were the largest part of the business. And often when the electricity failed, then whole batches of eggs and newborn chicks would die. So that was a significant waste issue. It caused a loss of money for the organization. And we explored multiple waste issues like that. But then when we went to the local community, they talked about a waste issue that was completely different. They said what's happening is the company is dumping its waste, which was body parts, feces, all sorts of kind of organic matter in the local community, and it's causing a public health hazard, and it's stinking the whole community out. And the relationship between the local community and the organization had broken down, with the local community not wanting to even talk to people in the organization anymore. And we went to the company and said, you didn't mention any of this. And they said, yeah, it is going on. And we've tried to deal with it. We've tried to move the dumping ground further away, but it doesn't seem to make any difference. And they just didn't know what to do with it. Now, at first we thought what was happening is that the local community were just being marginalized here, and we had to deal with that as a situation of marginalization. But it wasn't like that, because the community had gone to the government and were getting environmental health inspectors to give progressive fines to the organization. So the community had some leverage, and it was really an embedded conflict. Now, the good news is that we actually were able to work with them in actually bringing them together and looking at it from all of the perspectives and the value that could be attained from addressing this kind of systemic problem. And the solution that emerged out of these kinds of workshops that included the local community, it included workers, it included the management, and there were also interviews with government stakeholders. They realized that they could actually generate biogas from that waste to create a more reliable electricity supply. But when they actually did some of the technical work on it, they realized there wasn't enough waste. They actually had to double production in order to generate enough waste. So they did some market research, realized there was a market for that doubling in production. They invested in it. And we ended up with a quadruple win. So we ended up basically addressing the public health problem. There was no more dumping in the community. There was a reliable electricity supply for the organization. Their profitability increased, and there were also then more jobs for local people. So it was a quadruple win all round. So this is how, if you understand how to conceptualize a conflict, you can begin to see where the intervention points are. You can begin to see, well, actually these two issues are related together. We can work across the different boundary judgments made by the stakeholders. We can actually take account of their different purposes and values, and actually a win-win emerged out of that. So let me just go back quickly just to remind you of the shape of this. So that's a boundary judgment, who and what's included, and what purposes and values people are pursuing. You can represent marginalization like this as well. And I'm going to talk you through this because it's a bit complex, this diagram. But you can see here, there's a narrow boundary judgment being made by one stakeholder group and a wider one made by another stakeholder group. And then there's things in the margins. Different purposes and values are associated with those different boundaries. And I'll talk you through an example so it's not so abstract. The example I'm going to talk through is of unemployment. So imagine you've got an ethical organization who's based in a local community. They're interested in the welfare of their own employees, so they look after their ethical employers. They look after the welfare of their own employees, but they're not interested in unemployed people in the local community. It's basically not their problem. They need to just look after their own employees. So that's the narrow boundary around just their own employees. and the purpose there is to look after their own. You have a campaign group in the local community who says, this is a large organization in our community. We've got our unemployment problem. And of course, they should be interested in this. It's their responsibility to help to create jobs for local people. And so what you have here is a situation where they make a wider boundary. They're looking at the whole community. And what's in between these two boundary judgments are the people who are unemployed and the issue of unemployment. And what I realized when I first was looking at these kinds of situations, and I looked at multiple situations of marginalization like this, that you think that when somebody identifies this kind of conflict, of value conflict, and the marginalization around it, that people would just address it. But mostly they don't. Mostly these kinds of situations embed. And I looked at what happens and why these things are embed. And I use the term sacred or profane here, not in a religious sense, but to underscore the strength of the value judgments that are imposed on what's in the margins. So, for example, the employees in this organization, when they hear that there are people who think that they should be dealing with unemployment, will say, why do we have to give our tax money to unemployed people? They're not working for their money, and they make them profane, essentially. They talk about them as lazy scroungers and these kinds of things. They make them profane. In contrast, the campaign group will say, if we can harness the energy of the unemployed, they can be the vanguard of a new political movement and we can make real political change. And they put them on a pedestal, they're making them sacred. So there's this clash of interpretation of whatever is in the margins. And I know that from personal experience, both being unemployed and ending up having to sign a register saying I was available for work, which is basically a ritual that holds that kind of profane, it's a kind of a ritual that reinforces the profane status of the unemployed. And I've also stood outside unemployment benefit offices campaigning politically and trying to recruit people who are unemployed to a political party. So we have that situation of this conflict, and it's stabilized with one thing dominant through the kinds of rituals. So one of those rituals, for example, is signing a register saying you're available for work. It's functional for the system to say they can offer you a job, but it's also an exercise in ritual humiliation. Now, that kind of theory of marginalization is really relevant, I think, across many, many projects, especially when you've got complex stakeholder relationships, power relationships going on. And often environmental issues get marginalized. And it's really important to begin to think about how you actually address marginalization so you can give people in marginalized positions the ability to speak, to have their voices amplified as part of the process, and actually include them as and take account of the way that the marginalization operates. So again, let me just give you a practical example. I did a project in the late 90s, early 2000s, which was working for 3 voluntary organizations who wanted us to help develop new services for young people living on the streets of Manchester in the UK. So there are police estimated there are about 2,000 homeless children on the streets of Manchester in any one year. And they're marginalized in 2 ways. So they're regarded as less rational, less able to make informed decisions about their own lives than adults. And then if they're living on the streets, they've got no form of income. They'll often get involved in petty crime just to survive on the streets. And so that's they can be marginalized by being thought of as troubled teenagers. So we knew if we wanted to do what the people who were commissioning us wanted and what we wanted to do, which was actually involve the young people centrally in the design of these services so that we knew that they would actually address their needs and not just be another professional kind of design that didn't quite meet the requirements, then we had to deal with this kind of marginalization. And these are the kinds of things we did. And you might want to think in your own projects about how you might address marginalisation in other ways. So the first thing we did is we went on the streets for 3 months, seeking out young people at night. And so that we interviewed young people on the streets. And so the voices of those young people were not crowded out. And we did that before we ever talked to any of the professionals. And actually, when the one of the voluntary organizations we were working with saw how keen young people were to tell their stories, they changed their whole street work policy and actually were much more proactive and went out on the streets looking for homeless children. So the other thing we did when we did talk to the agencies is we communicated the children's own words and not just ours to professionals. That's really important because you change people's minds not by a purely kind of rational argument, but also through the emotional experience that you can convey. People change their minds through their feelings and not just through the facts that they see. So when you, for example, tell a story from a 13-year-old in her own words of how she got involved in prostitution at the age of 12 just to survive on the streets, it's so compelling that none of those agencies turned their backs on the project when they actually had no statutory responsibility to be part of it, but they voluntarily committed to it. We also used design methods, the same design methods with young people as with professionals. It would have been so easy just to get young people's views and then get the professionals to design the services. But we really wanted to make sure that the ideas from the two groups were comparable. And actually, the professionals said, we can actually implement nearly everything that the young people wanted. And perhaps the trickiest bit was ensuring that really tough issues were dealt with. So there were some accusations of verbal and physical abuse by the police. And we tackled that head on. So we held a workshop with the police. We gave them all the quotations from young people, both positive and negative. And the police just picked up the ball and ran with it. And within a couple of hours, we had several pilot projects to tackle that kind of issue designed, and they were implemented within 2 weeks. So these are the kinds of things that you might think about in order to deal with marginalisation. I'm going to move on to the second quadrant now, and I'll do these quadrants a little bit quicker because I realise I've spent a lot of time on that first one. So approaches for understanding complex causality. The example I'm going to give you is from system dynamics, which was originally developed by Forrester in the 1960s. It was originally developed as a computer modeling technique, but a lot of people these days do it much more quickly as a diagramming technique. So it's a much more qualitative kind of process. Now, the situation here, this diagram comes from a project I did in New Zealand. The situation was that some of the environmental scientists we were working with had done some research that suggested that the reason New Zealand has the highest level of Campylobacter food poisoning, Campylobacter is a food poisoning bacterium. The reason it has the highest level of that in the OECD countries is because of the number of dairy cattle in the country, and the dairy cattle poo into the rivers. The water from the rivers goes into the drinking water system, and people pick up the bacteria and get infected. Now, the dairy industry is worth $8 billion to the New Zealand economy. That's something like 52% of the exports of New Zealand. Anytime there's any bad news about the dairy industry, it is front page headlines in the newspapers. So what happened is that there was an immediate outcry with the Farmers Union and other agricultural stakeholders just screaming, no, this is not true. The science is wrong. The union was saying it was going to withdraw support for all the science that was being done on water in our institute. And the senior management of our institute came to my team and said, can you facilitate something to get these people talking again? You know, you don't have to solve the problem, but if you can get them talking reasonably, we can actually find a way through it. So they wouldn't actually go into the same room and talk to each other directly at the beginning. So we worked with the different groups separately. And once they'd actually worked out the causality as they saw it from their particular perspectives, we then brought them together. And they were quite willing then to come together, because what they thought they were going to do was justify their perspective to the other stakeholders, and they thought they were going to win an argument. And what our team did was effectively pull the rug from under that perspective. We pinned all of these diagrams on the wall, and we asked people to walk around and look for things in other people's diagrams that had a causal relationship with things in their own diagrams. And gradually across the morning, we joined all these diagrams up into what you see in front of you there. You don't need to know the detail of it. The point was that it dawned on everybody that you can't just say, for example, that food poisoning comes from the dairy system, or food poisoning comes from the human sewage system, or it comes from the wild duck system. All of these things have to be joined up, and Compilobacter actually flows through the whole system. So it gave a much more subtle understanding of the causality and got the people talking reasonably again. For sure, there were still disagreements, but we actually achieved what we set out to do, which was getting people talking again. Let's hop down now to the bottom left quadrant. This is about developing viable and highly responsive organizations at multiple scales. And the example I'm going to give you is Stafford Beer's viable system model. Now, if any of you in the audience know this model, you'll realize that what I'm going to present is a highly simplified version of it. It's quite a complex model. There's a lot more subtlety in it than I'm going to give you, but this is really what I can achieve in 5 minutes on this model. So let's see, you can use this kind of model to either look for problems in current organizations, so you could diagnose organizational failures, or you can use it to design new organizations. Mostly I've used it to design new organizations, but sometimes to diagnose current problems. And the example I'll talk you through, just to make it a little less abstract, is a project that Angela Espinosa, Maya Vachkova, and myself finished couple of years ago, right in the middle of COVID. We diagnosed the COVID response of a hospital trust in the UK, using this model to look at all the issues. And that was between 2 waves, so that the hospital trust could get itself in better shape to respond to the next wave more effectively. So what Stafford Beer says in this model is that any organization, to be viable, has to meet some need in its environment. So, for example, if it's a university, they need to meet the needs of applicants applying for student places. In the case of a hospital, then they need to serve patients with medical needs. So your first task is to actually look at how you segment the environment to identify the various needs that you're going to address. So in a COVID situation, it was really necessary to understand that there are going to be some patients who are going to be admitted to hospital with COVID. They had to be isolated from the other patients that had, for example, heart attacks and cancer and strokes. And then there are some people with cancer and heart attacks and strokes who also have COVID. So you have 3 different kind of key categories there. And you need to be able to provide appropriate responses to each of those. So those in the hospital system are the wards that are separated off and provide services to the different patient needs. Now, if you've got multiple operational units like that, then you also need some coordination between those units. So in a hospital system, this was the testing patients to determine which ward that somebody goes to, It's the capacity and resourcing of staff, because when you got an upsurge of COVID patients, you had to transfer staff into the COVID wards. And likewise, when it calmed down, you could actually move those staff back into ordinary patient care. So it's moving staff around. Then you've got the kind of day-to-day management that audits the work of those operational units. There are things like KPIs that matter in relation to this. And there was a key issue in the hospital because all of the KPIs were set by the government. So they were collecting a lot of information that provided information to the government about what was happening, but that information was useless to them at the operational level of providing the service. It just helped the government get its aggregated statistics together. So we had to help them redevelop a whole new set of KPIs that would be useful at the local level, and they implemented them alongside the government ones. Any organization needs foresight. It needs to be able to look at the organization, the environment, and be able to see where the threats and opportunities lie. It needs to be able to look internally at its own resources and see if it can meet those threats and opportunities. And this whole strategy of the organization gets developed in relation to that foresight. In the COVID hospital response, the key thing here was anticipating the new waves, because the geographical area we were working in was out of sync with the waves in the rest of the country. So just as the rest of the country was going, the COVID was receding, and with resources were being withdrawn by the government, COVID was ramping up in this hospital. So they actually had to make case to the government for resources that were out of step with the rest of the country. And then you've got the final part of this model, which is really about the ethos, the policy, the valuing of staff. It's the kind of things that maintain the identity of the organization, that make it a healthcare organization. And you saw radical changes during COVID because the public and private sector cooperated in a way that just doesn't happen under normal circumstances, or not to the same extent at any rate. So you can use this kind of organizational template really to either diagnose problems or to design new organizations. You can do this at multiple scales. So you can do this we did this at the ward level, we did this at a hospital level, and we did this at a whole trust level. But theoretically, you could go to national and international levels. Now, I've used this usually in partnership with others to do a number of different things. I've several times designed multi-agency systems. So when you've got lots of different organizations with different concerns, so you might have environmental organizations, social policy organizations, health organizations that need to coordinate together, you can actually build the interagency system using that kind of model. I've done that in housing, health, and social care, for example. I've used in New Zealand, I've helped advise a public inquiry into transforming the family violence service system. We use this model to diagnose nationally the whole family violence service system and the problems with it. And I'll just give you, and I've used this also in our Environmental Science Institute in New Zealand. We actually looked at the environment, at all the emerging policy concerns of government, and how we could actually realign our own groups to meet the policy needs, so that research directly met the policy needs. And we designed this system of foresight and management and ethos and coordination around these operational research units to kind of meet the needs of government. I noticed going on their website a couple of months ago that the groups that we defined are still there on their website 13 years later. So I think we had some success in aligning with policy agendas. Just one last example of this. This comes from work of Maniscalco, one of my ex-PhD students who got her PhD for this kind of work. She got her PhD in 2023. What she was working on is the interface between international organized crime and local gang violence. So what she noticed in the United States is that there's extraordinary amounts of local gang violence. And the reason is that you get, as a gang leader, you get recruited to international organized crime, depending on the amount of violence you perpetrate. So the more people you kill and maim, the more likely it is you're going to be recruited to internationally organized crime and get the really lucrative opportunities, which then massively escalates local gang violence at street level. And what Pam realized is that these organizations dealing with these two levels just don't talk to each other. They have virtually no connection with each other. So she ended up bringing the stakeholders together, first of all, so that they looked at their system, and this is their representation of their system, and the various coloured lines represent the jurisdictions of their agencies. You can see lots of overlaps, parts of the problem not being dealt with at all. After having kind of worked out that, she actually did the design work using a viable system model to help them design a multi-agency system. And then they were actually so enthusiastic about that that several of them went back into their own organizations and talked about that work, what they could do at a lower level within their organizations as well as between their organizations. So these are the kinds of things that can be useful also in environmental projects. It's not just social projects like the international organized crime situation that Pam Sidelko was dealing with. And the last one I want to look at is a methodology for exploring multiple perspectives. And the example I'm going to give is Peter Checkland's soft systems methodology. And rather than give you one big case study, I'm just going to give you lots of little examples along the way. I'm going to kind of walk you through the process of soft systems methodology. Basically, what it is it's a qualitative approach to support learning between people with different views who are trying to manage a really messy, unclear situation. So it's a bit of a mess. People have different perspectives on what they think ought to be done, and they need to learn their way through that. And you can do it in a fully participative way. You can bring people together in workshops, or you can do it with a researcher as an intermediary going between the different participants and working with them separately. If you can get them to get into workshops, and that's sometimes difficult, it's a lot better because you get the communication between the peoples themselves, and they evolve their own solutions with more ownership, I think, that way. So the first thing you do is that you map the mess that you're dealing with, the problematic situation you're dealing with. And this is an example of how you can do this. So this particular it's called a rich picture. It's a diagram done by the stakeholders in a workshop. And we were doing a feasibility study in New Zealand for dealing with water management issues, because this area, dryland area in Tasman, was 60% over allocated, and their farmers wanted to invest in building a new storage dam. And we worked with them, not just to look at the dam, but to look at a whole range of potential water storage options that were suggested by different stakeholders. And we compared the dam that they came in wanting to that. But the first thing we did was the rich picture. This is the kind of messy situation that they wanted to get to grips with. Now, you won't understand what's in there. You can probably see that there's a river down the middle of it, and you can see there's some trees at the side and some anglers and kayakers and various things in here. But you don't need to know the detail. The people in the room understood this because they were explaining it as they were drawing it, and their understanding was evolving. It doesn't matter if people disagree on the situation. It's kind of the point that the disagreement is part of the context, and you can actually represent the disagreements in the diagram. And it's a relief to people that they actually don't have to confront their disagreements head on, but they can actually just hear about the different perspectives and represent them in the diagram. That's really quite key. I was doing this recently in a training workshop with local government people. And every single person said that something had been surfaced, but from other people that they were completely unaware of. So this really helps people get a better picture of the complexity. Here's another example. Last month, I was working with environmental policymakers and some of their major stakeholders in the Scottish government. And the civil servants had been given complete freedom to really rethink environmental policy making from scratch. So the first part was actually mapping all the issues that they were dealing with and all the assets they had available in this kind of rich picture. Again, I mean, I couldn't begin to tell you what's in there, but people who were in the workshop knew. And out of this kind of analysis grew 4 quite radically new policy options that they wanted to pursue. That's currently going through the process of approvals by their senior leadership and before it goes to the politicians. So hopefully we'll see those kinds of ideas emerging soon. Once you have got a richer perspective on what the problem is, you can begin to look at the transformations that people want to see. So what systems could you design? What organizational systems, what policy changes could you design that embody transformations, and what do those mean to different people? And I like to use this mnemonic called Batwave. It's not what Checkland originally talked about, but I think it's a little bit more useful because it includes things like victims and beneficiaries in it. So you look at the transformation, you say, from this point of view, let's say you have somebody wanting to let's say the situation, let's make one up. Situation is that you have a drought created through climate change, and you have some stakeholders who are saying we need to provide food aid. So the transformation is to create a population that's fed. From the point of view, worldview is we need to provide food aid to save lives. Then you can work out who's going to benefit, who's going to make it happen, who are the owners, that's who can stop it from working, not financial owners. Who could be victims here and what do you do about that? And what are the constraints you're working with? Resources, legal constraints, those kinds of things. Now, there might be a different transformation. Other people might be saying, actually, what we need to do is create better resilience to climate change. So the worldview here is about improving people's long-term sustainability of their food production. And a whole different set of beneficiaries and actors and owners and victims and environmental constraints would apply. So you basically look at the different transformations that are possible, and you get a better mutual understanding of the variety of possibilities that could be pursued. Now, the point here is not to force an agreement on one transformation that everybody wants to see. You're trying to keep as much variety on the table because the actual solutions will emerge out of dialogue between those people who are supporting the different viewpoints. So you might, for example, get people saying, well, there's no point dealing with the longer term sustainability issues without feeding people first, but maybe we should get onto that later. So you end up with a solution that actually joins those two different approaches up. Once you've got that kind of picture of what a transformation looks like, you can begin to go the next step and actually look at what the actions are that would bring that transformation into being. And you map the activities in the simple diagrams like this. This one comes from a project I did for the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology in New Zealand, and they had commissioned 4 30-year roadmaps for investment in biotechnology, nanotechnology, energy research, and environment research. And they'd had a lot of stakeholder conflict. So they asked my team if we could evaluate the process that they use to develop the roadmaps, not the content of the roadmaps. And the diagram you see here is the map of the activities that they actually did before we actually got them to think about the changes that they want based on their Batwove analysis. So I won't go into detail. There's just one key change that really mattered. What they actually did that caused the conflict was that they set up those individual roadmaps. They formed steering groups. They kind of did the framing of them and then took that out to stakeholder consultation. And because they'd made so many decisions in advance of talking to stakeholders, stakeholders got annoyed with them and said, you know, you're not representing our agenda here, and they got into conflict. Simply reversing those two steps was all that was needed. They did the stakeholder consultation before making those framing decisions and then took things out for wider consultation. And we followed them up doing a fifth roadmap, a food roadmap, and it was a completely different atmosphere. You know, there were people were really engaged positively in developing those ideas. Now, so again, you have multiple maps of different activities that could be undertaken. This is not about narrowing down on solutions. It's only when you've got all of those that you begin to look for accommodations and agree changes. So the word accommodations is quite critical. It doesn't mean consensus. It's very rare when you get a really complex problem situation that you're going to get consensus between people, but you can still agree next steps forward. It doesn't mean compromise either. When people hear the word compromise, they often think they're going to have to give up something in order to get something. And so they get quite defensive and it's quite difficult to reach agreements. What you're looking for is emergent learning that enables people to see different steps forward that they might not have identified at the beginning. And very often that's quite possible. I mean, it was quite interesting in the Scottish Government example, when we asked people about early on in the process, people's confidence that they would know what the next steps for their policymaking would be. There were really quite different views from different people, but a lot of people were really unsure that they had a way forward. By the time we got to this end point, people were really, really quite confident that they could actually propose things to their senior leaders that would make a difference. So really, you're looking for emergent learning, and then you can move on to action. Now, I'll give you one just quick example of this, because the very first project I ever did was in the late, not using this approach, was in the late 1990s, and it was working with 19 different agencies who had the task of developing a counselling response to be activated in the event of a disaster in a local region. So the government had given every local region of the UK a time by which they had to have these counselling responses designed. And there were these 19 agencies. They've been working 18 months together in a 2-hour meeting every Wednesday evening, and they'd failed to reach any kind of agreement. It was just too complex. They had different visions of what the counselling response should look like. And we worked with them in 6 days of workshops. So they put 6 whole days aside out of 3 months to do this kind of working through of the issues. They came out with plans for developing this counselling response, and they were implemented. Government funded them, and they were actually actioned when there was a train crash in the locality, which is why there's a picture of a train crash there. And the newspapers made particular mention of the quality of the counselling response that was provided to victims and victims' families. So I want to highlight that example, because when it comes to participative approaches like this, you often hear people saying that they're time consuming, people can't afford to put the time together in workshops. But we did in 6 days what they were unable to do in 18 months of regular meetings. So although it's inconvenient to convene workshops, if you can do it, then it's far more efficient, actually, than the usual kinds of meeting processes. Now, I'm just up to my hour now, so I'm going to just leave you with I'm going to leave you with just some systemic principles for managing wicked problems, just 3 kind of starting principles. And I'm going to show you two cartoons, and then we'll end, and I'll open up to questions. So the first principle is explore boundaries, the stakeholders and issues, the values, purposes, processes of conflict and marginalization. Explore that up front and revisit those boundaries as new aspects of the wicked problem present themselves. The reason for that is that you don't even know what interrelationships or perspectives or systems that you need to account for. So actually exploring those boundaries really matters up front. Second principle is draw upon and mix methods from across all of these things, from across any approaches that you currently use, including the traditional scientific approaches, and just be as responsive as you can to the multiple dimensions of wicked problems. I don't personally believe that any methodology can do everything that people ask for it. You have to be quite creative and mix methods in relation to the context. Now, you might think it's strange that I've got the biophysical and social sciences in there, but actually being systemic is not really about the methods themselves. It's the approach you take to designing the project and designing the whole process. And some of the methods help with it as well, but you may find that some of those more traditional scientific methods are useful as part of the process. And the third principle is one that I wish I didn't have to say, but if you've got no previous or very limited experience, just start from where you are, because you can't start from anywhere else. Try a new method when the need arises, and build capacity for the longer term. So you might have a new project. Just think about the one new method that might actually augment what you're doing. Learn it, embed it, then do the same the next time. You'll find before you know it, you're 10 years in and you've got a whole battery of different systems approaches that you're drawing upon. Now, the reason I say I wish I didn't have to say that is because when we train doctors and engineers, we tend to train them for between 5 and 9 years. And yet people are expected to pick up systems thinking in a weekend course. And it's an absurdity, really, when you consider the amount that's available and the practice that's necessary. So I tell people to start where they are and work from there. So let's leave you with just two cartoons. I think this kind of summarizes the different things that systems thinking are useful for. The first one is the fable of the blind men and the elephant. Now, I know that people in the UK, it's commonplace to know this, but there are people international in the audience, and there are countries that don't have this idea. So what's going on here is that lots of different blind men are feeling an elephant, but they don't realize it's an elephant because they're only feeling part of it. So this is kind of what's often going on in wicked problems, that one person is seeing this as an environmental issue, another person is seeing it as a business issue of sustainability, another person is seeing it as a social, cultural issue. And what you're doing is you're providing a common language, a language of systems that helps people join these kinds of things up and really gets a better understanding of how things are working as systems. But there's actually a worse situation to be dealing with than everybody not really seeing the elephant. And that is in the second cartoon, when everybody's seeing it as an elephant, but they're not actually appreciating the variety of the complexity of what's out there. They're all saying it's an elephant when it's not. And this is what people often call groupthink, when there's kind of social pressure to all just agree, and you can use systems thinking to challenge groupthink. So just a very quick example, an early project I did was with the Central Water Company of Peru. I did this with a couple of colleagues. We did a consultancy where the Central Water Company was about to be privatized, and they were going to be split up into 9 constituent companies. And they wanted to know whether there was a case for retaining any kind of statutory provision, or whether their Central Water Company would just disappear when these private enterprises came into being. And I remember talking with the chief executive, and the way he defined the project was as a business problem. And I thought this is problematic because, you know, if they're all seeing this in one way, and water is an ecological resource, I said to him, I'm only going to go ahead with this if we can actually bring an ecologist in, and so that we can actually see what another perspective might offer you. And so we did that. They agreed to that. We had somebody from Friends of the Earth in. She sat quiet for the whole of the first day of this consultancy, where they fruitlessly discussed this business problem. And I thought, this isn't working. So I started the second day by asking her to say something about water resources in the country. She put a map of Peru up on the wall, and which had all the rivers and where the 9 companies would be on each of these 9 rivers. And she showed how the aquifers were joining up the water resources underground. And one of these senior managers said, so you mean to say if somebody doesn't do their job properly in one of these companies and allows the water to be polluted, it's going to affect everybody else's water too? Yes, that's exactly right. So immediately they saw that there needed to be some kind of role for an independent body that would keep the players honest. Now, I think it's, I've worked with a lot of policymakers who have these kinds of aha moments, and they end up becoming lifelong advocates for a systems approach once they have these kinds of aha moments. And it's one of the really rewarding things about working in this space, to see those aha moments unfolding, and to realize you can actually make a difference in facilitating people to develop their own systemic learning. So with that, I'll hand over for questions.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much, Gerald. So we've got around about 15 minutes left now for questions from the audience. So we've had a few that have come in through the chat already. Yeah, I'll start off with the first one we've had. So somebody was asking about the example you gave about the dairy sector. This was in New Zealand. So they've asked, how do you identify ghosts in a systems map, and are ghosts key factors in the map?
So can the person explain what they mean by ghosts?
Yeah, if they're still in.
Let's go back to that. I think I know what they mean, but just to check so I don't go off on a completely different loop.
Sorry, thank you, Joe. I was just addressing, you had your stocking rate, you highlighted in green.
Yeah.
The green variables are ghosts, they appear more than once.
Yeah, that's what I thought you meant.
But they could have different language if different people are identifying them. How would you know they're the same thing? And are these like critical factors? Because when you have these complex maps, it's hard to know which of these are maybe key factors in the map. So that was my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so there are different possible ways to answer this. The simple reason that there's 2 stocking rates is that it wasn't possible to draw the map easily. It would just become too messy if we hadn't represented it twice. It's as simple as that. How do we know that they mean the same thing? That was what the morning of exploration was. Actually, when people spotted a connection, they would explore it between themselves, and it's the dialogue that begins to work out if they're really meaning the same thing by those things. So you build up a common understanding across in this case half a day. Now, how do you know which are the most significant interactions? This is a really difficult one, because somebody like Jay Forrester, for example, who developed it originally as a computer modeling approach, and he would say it's very limited what you can get from a qualitative approach, because once you actually do a lot of science and begin to populate this with numbers, there are always massive surprises that show themselves. So you might find that where that you need to intervene is not where you initially thought. So there's limitations to do it qualitatively, but the fact is that you can't spend 18 months. We couldn't spend 18 months developing a quantitative model, and it would have taken more than that with this amount of complexity anyway. The scientists were saying this is 10 years of research to populate this quantitatively. So we did what we could. And the interesting thing is, the point of doing this was not to find the final solutions to Campylobacter. It was to get the stakeholders talking again so that that could be worked out longer term. And actually, some of the longer term solutions were really very simple, like farmers washing their hands, because what they noticed is that a lot of new farm labourers got sick when they started because they hadn't built up any immunity to these kinds of bugs. But there were also things that could be done in the drinking water system, for example, as well as in the dairy system.
Thanks very much. So I take from that if you can do a quantitative model, it is very hard to identify some of those key points, but you don't necessarily need to do that to identify some very effective solutions. Is that the
that way you will get more insight from a quantitative model, and if you're dealing with something like climate change, of course it's I mean, we're horrified by how fast it's moving, but it's slow enough to model quantitatively, and there are lots of people doing that. So I think that's worthwhile. But when you're dealing with a problem on the fly, like a stakeholder conflict, where you really have to get people talking again quickly, then you can only do it qualitatively.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, I'll move on to the next question we had through. So this is from Christopher Fry, who's saying, using your various approaches, how would you approach the ban oil protesters who demand stopping all use of fossil fuels, which of course is impractical in the short term?
Yeah, this is interesting. I'm going to draw an analogy with another project I did, which was similar in relation to that. So it was a water management strategy that was needing to be developed in Canterbury in New Zealand, and there's this guy Brian Jenkins who's leading the development of this strategy. Now, they were paralyzed. They'd had 30-year pretty much decision paralysis. And what was going on is that you had the elected council was split between people who were promoting economic values and saying, you know, we just need to treat the water as a resource, and people championing environmental values, and we're talking about environmental protection. And the regional council who had responsibility for environmental protection was spending a lot of its resources on legal battles in the courts as farmers tried to take more and more water. So they weren't even able to enforce their regulations effectively, and they had to look for an alternative. Now, one of the issues here was that there were environmentalists in that situation who simply said, we stop the water take, it's over allocated, and we simply shouldn't be doing dairy farming in some of these places. It's just simply wrong. It's kind of there's bottom lines that are being compromised, and that simply shouldn't happen. Now, one of the things that went on is that we did some work looking at the interactions between 10 major policy decision areas, including climate change, irrigation, biodiversity, all of these major policy issues, and came out with 3 possible strategies, one of which was which is the one that ended up breaking through the conflict, was to completely reconfigure governance and go for creative new technological solutions for water saving, with these multi-stakeholder governance committees. Now, the environmentalists were on those governance committees, and this happened after I'd already left New Zealand, but I was in communication with a group of researchers who carried on the work after I'd left it. And they did a lot of work actually with this kind of model building, looking at the indicators that people could use across environmental and economic and social policy areas. And the rule was that the governance of the governance committee, the catchment scale, was not allowed to just pursue one of these measures at the expense of the others. So they actually had to put environmental mitigation in along the way as they made the economic development decisions. One of the really critical things was getting to people to understand the time lags in the system. So there was a huge time lag with leaching into the water, often taking 60 years to leach through rocks, which means that the environmental mitigators that you put in place were not going to actually have an effect for until 2 generations down the track. So the more people learned about this, the more they became committed to the governance. And I did a follow-up after 5 years, and they were really singing the praises of this governance system. I went back to Canterbury a couple of years ago, and the system was in the middle of collapse. The reason the system was in the middle of collapse is that they had actually taken out, they'd had efficiency savings and removed all the governance facilitators who understood the legacy that they were working with, understood the theory behind this. And once those people had been taken away, and there was enough turnover between people, they lost the understanding of the time lags that they were working with and how they actually work across these variables. And the environmentalists walked away because they went back to their position that it has to be dealt with now. So I think it was very unfortunate how it unfolded longer term, but I really saw the solution working in those first 5 years. I wanted to be honest that it didn't sustain for 15 years, but it did sustain certainly for the first period. Does that help? It's that I mean, I've also tried to get discussions going between environmental groups and oil companies, and at one point started to be successful until there was a kind of a block put on that. It's very hard, and you sometimes have to work with groups separately, but facilitating the learning is key.
That's great. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on that, Gerald. Okay, so we've just got a few minutes left, and I can see there's still a few questions left in the chat. So I'm going to come to 2 that feel a little bit shorter first, and then yeah, we'll see how it goes. So somebody's asked, the Peru project that you mentioned right at the end there sounds very interesting. Is there any documentation that's available that you can share?
I'm afraid there isn't. This was I don't know why, but I never wrote that one up. It was a really strange situation because I'd been invited to do a keynote at a conference, and only when I turned up at the conference they said, "Oh, do you realize that we're paying your airfares by you doing a consultancy in exchange for them?" No, I had no idea. So we're kind of with 3 of us thrown into doing this consultancy at virtually no notice, and then we just didn't follow up to write it up afterwards. And I have to say, I mean, I must have done 120, 130 projects over the years. I've probably written up maybe a quarter of them, and I need to carve out time to do that in retirement, I guess.
Oh, thanks, Gerald. And then there was, yeah, this may end up being the last one we come to, but someone's asked, is systems thinking taught in schools? It seems like a perfect opportunity to enlighten and equip this younger.
That's a huge issue. Depends where you are in the world, whether you get to learn it at school. In America, there's the Waters Foundation, which is putting a lot of emphasis on teaching this kind of approach, more of a system dynamics type approach in schools. A woman I work with, Kerry Turner, has been trying in the UK system to get systems thinking looked at in schools, but the national curriculum that we have in the UK absolutely prevents this, because decisions are made centrally by central government on what gets into the curriculum. And it's just, I mean, Kerry was going to do a PhD with me on actually getting systems thinking into schools and evaluating its use. And she could never basically take up apart from a few small private schools. But that's not very helpful. We need it to go to the broad range of people and not just a few private schools. There are some interesting experiments in other countries. So in Vietnam, Oki Bosch and Nan Nguyen, they worked on a really great project. 50,000 school children were learning about system dynamics, and they learned it through it's kind of a policy game where they had to make policy decisions and then see how things unfolded, and then work out what they were going to do next. And I mean, we've had I'm doing a project at the moment with colleagues in 4 other universities, where we're looking at a new bean that's been developed for growing in the UK, so it can replace some North American imports. And we've developed a game about beans that supports children learning about ecosystems and the bean, the social and ecological systems around bean growing. And that's been really successful, introducing that into a school. But these are, relatively small experiments compared to what is really ideally needed. One thing, can I just add one thing to that? Yeah. There are some people, and I don't agree with this, there are some people who believe that systems thinking is one of those things that you mature into, that it's a kind of advanced level of cognitive development, and so there's no point teaching it even at undergraduate level, let alone at school level, that it's something you have to have real work experience to understand. And I just don't believe that. I mean, I actually, when I was moving house, I found when I was 10 years old doing the water cycle using flow diagrams, that was done with me at school, and maybe that had some influence at some subtle level. But I actually believe we think systemically, fairly naturally, and it's knocked out of us by a curriculum that divides subjects and divides things into teachable lumps.
Oh, thank you, Gerald. So yeah, unfortunately, that's about all we have time for today. So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to you for your time. And yeah, you've got lots of comments in the chat as well from people saying thank you. And it's been a really great session. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you as well to everyone who's joined. And yeah, the people that weren't able to catch the whole thing, then yeah, we'll be sharing the recording up on our YouTube page within the next week as well. I've dropped some links into the chat, so you should be able to access that through there. And I also just wanted to highlight that we've got another event that's coming up in a couple of weeks as part of this same project on turning the tide, systems thinking for a sustainable ocean. That's on protecting vulnerable coastal communities from climate change driven coastal change. So yeah, the link, as I say, is in the chat. So if people do sign up to attend that one, that would be great.
Sorry, just let me say, I'm just going to put my email address in the chat. And if anybody does want, although I hadn't written that particular project up, if anybody wants written materials about this sort of work, then just let me know.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Gerald. I'm sure people really appreciate that. Amazing. Okay, well, on that note, then I think I will, yeah, close the session for today. But yeah, once again, a massive thank you, Gerald, and yeah, people joining. And yeah, hope to see people on another session again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.